The night I found out the HOA had stolen my land, I couldn't breathe. 1,500 acres, my father's blood, my grandfather's sweat, and my own calloused hands, keeping it alive, vanished in a line of paperwork I never signed. I remember standing in the empty kitchen of my ranch house, the late evening light spilling across the old wooden floors. Shaking so hard I had to grab the counter just to stay on my feet. I wasn't just robbed of dirt and trees. They'd taken my family's legacy, the only thing tying me to the people I'd already buried. And they thought I'd roll over. They thought they could play with my life like I was nothing. But they didn't know what they had just set in motion. It started with a letter I almost didn't open. A thick white envelope tucked into my rusty old mailbox, stamped with the HOA's name like a taunt. I thought it was another one of their ridiculous fines. Last time, it was because my tractor sat too visibly near the road. But when I ripped it open and read, my vision blurred. It wasn't a fine. It was a notification of sale. My 1,500 acres had been sold in absentia after delinquent dues had accumulated dues I never owed. Because my land wasn't even part of their damned subdivision. I wasn't under their jurisdiction. I never signed a thing. But somehow, someway, they filed fake claims, and the county records now listed my property as transferred. Sold. I drove into town that night, hands gripping the wheel until my knuckles went white. At the courthouse, the clerk behind the glass looked at me like I was some angry lunatic when I demanded answers. "Sir, it shows here you forfeited the property," she said, tapping her computer. My voice cracked when I told her that land had been in my family since before the HOA even existed. My father built the barn with his bare hands. My grandfather died mending fences on that soil. But the clerk just shook her head. "The records are updated. If you have proof otherwise, you'll need to contest it legally." I stumbled out into the night, standing under the harsh yellow glow of the streetlights. Proof? How do you prove something so obvious? It was mine. Everyone in this county knew it was mine. Yet the law suddenly said otherwise. For weeks, I barely slept. I fought through stacks of paperwork, called lawyers who told me they couldn't take on a case that deep without serious money up front. The HOA had locked me out of my own barns with shiny new padlocks. They'd even sent a letter warning me that trespassing on HOA-owned property would lead to my arrest. Arrest for walking on my own dirt. I remember sitting on the porch one night, staring at the empty fields that stretched into the darkness, feeling like a failure. My wife, Emily, tried to comfort me, her hand resting on my shoulder. But I could see the worry in her eyes, the fear. She'd married me, believing I could keep her safe, keep our family secure. Now we had nothing but debts and a hollowed-out shell of a life. The breaking point came when my son, Daniel, asked me why we couldn't go fishing at the pond anymore. That pond was where my father had taught me how to cast a line, where Daniel caught his first fish at age 7, where we'd spent countless evenings watching the sun burn down into the hills. I had to tell him we weren't allowed there anymore because they took it. His little face scrunched up in confusion. "But it's ours," he said simply. And I couldn't answer. I couldn't look him in the eye because deep inside, I felt like I'd failed him. But that night, Emily held Daniel close and tried to hide her tears. Something inside me shifted. A cold, sharp clarity cut through the despair. They thought they had me cornered. They thought I'd drown in legal fees or drink myself numb. But they didn't realize I wasn't just fighting for land. I was fighting for the very soul of my family. And if they wanted a war, I was ready to play by their rules. I dug through records, every dusty old deed and survey my father had ever saved. I spent nights under the weak light of a single lamp, tracing the lineage of ownership back over a century. Okay. And then I found something the HOA hadn't counted on. A clause, a legal oversight buried in county records. They had filed false claims and sold my land. Yes, but in doing so, they had tied their own properties to mine through an old shared water rights contract. Every lakefront mansion in their shiny little subdivision depended on the water that flowed through my acres. Without legal access to that water, their homes were worthless. I don't think I smiled for weeks until that moment. Because for the first time, I realized I wasn't powerless. They'd taken everything from me, but they'd also handed me the knife that could cut them to pieces, so I got quiet. I stopped fighting them head-on, stopped showing my anger in public. I let them believe they had won. All the while, I was preparing my counterstrike. It wasn't loud or violent. It was legal, clean, and devastating. And when the time came, I wouldn't just reclaim what was mine. I'd make sure every smug face on that HOA board understood the cost of stealing from a man who had nothing left to lose. And when it finally came time to strike, I did it in a way that left them gasping for air. Because if they could illegally sell my 1,500 acres, I was more than willing legally to sell off their $10 million lakefront mansions. The morning after I discovered the water rights clause, I felt something I hadn't in months control. It was like a fire had been lit deep in my chest. The hopelessness that had been crushing me shifted into something sharper, colder. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I had a weapon, and the HOA didn't even know it existed. I drove out to the county archives again, this time with purpose. I pulled every dusty file, every brittle map, every document my family had ever signed regarding those lands. The clerk, the same one who had dismissed me weeks before, kept giving me wary glances as I stacked the papers on the counter. I didn't care. I wasn't some crazy rancher shouting about stolen land anymore. Was a man building a case, brick by brick, and deep down, I think she could see it in my eyes. That night, I laid the documents across the kitchen table. Emily sat with me, her face drawn with exhaustion, but I could see the spark of hope flickering behind her eyes again. Daniel was asleep upstairs, and the house was quiet except for the scratching of my pen as I highlighted sections, circled dates, and copied clauses. One line in particular glowed like a beacon. Water access and rights to Lake Cedar are contingent upon lawful association with adjoining acreage owned by the My Family Name Trust. It meant that when the HOA filed their fraudulent claim and forced my land into their subdivision, they unknowingly bound their precious lakefront homes to me. And since they owned my land now in paper, they had given me legal leverage over them. Their water, their lake, their luxury lifestyle of it ran through my veins. I leaned back, staring at the pile of papers, a bitter smile on my lips. They sold me, I whispered to Emily. But in doing so, they sold themselves to me. Emily's hand tightened around mine. She had seen me broken, hollow, ready to give up. Now, she was seeing the man she married again, the one who fought with his whole chest for the people he loved. "What are you going to do?" she asked softly. I didn't answer right away, because I already knew. I wasn't going to storm into another courthouse and beg for fairness. I wasn't going to scream at HOA meetings like they wanted me to. No, I was going to play it calm, play it slow, and let them think I disappeared. Then, when the knife was sharp enough, I'd twist it deep. The next week, I made calls. Discreet ones. A real estate attorney 2 towns over. Someone with no ties to our county. A property broker from the city used to handling commercial deals worth millions. They didn't know me, didn't know the history. All they cared about was paperwork and legality, and I had both on my side. I didn't tell Emily everything, not yet. Not because I didn't trust her, but because I knew how dangerous hope could be if it collapsed. I needed to be sure. Meanwhile, the HOA board carried on with their arrogance. They paraded around in their shiny SUVs, smiling smugly when they passed me at the gas station. I could hear whispers neighbors saying the rancher finally lost it. that I was being forced out by progress. They thought I was finished. But every time I saw them smirking, it only made my resolve harder. The first move I made wasn't loud. It was a single letter. Sent, certified, return receipt requested, addressed to the HOA board president, a man named Gregory Walters. A man with manicured hair, pressed suits, and the kind of smug confidence only people who never worked a day in their life seem to have. The letter was simple, polite, even. It informed him that due to the HOA's fraudulent sale of my 1,500 acres, all properties within their jurisdiction had unknowingly entered into a binding contract with me through the historic water rights clause. I enclosed the legal documentation. I informed them that as the new rightful holder of all associated water access rights, I now had full discretion over the use, sale, or lease of those rights. And then, in neat black ink at the bottom, I wrote, "You sold my land. Now, I own your lake." 3 days later, Walter showed up at my driveway in a rage, his SUV kicking up dust as he skidded to a stop. I was on the porch, sipping coffee, and I didn't even stand when he stormed up. His face was red, eyes bulging. "You think this is funny?" he spat, waving my letter in my face. "You think you can scare us with this garbage?" I met his anger with silence for a long moment, letting the weight of calm settle between us. Then I said, quiet and steady, "It's not a threat, it's the law. You tied yourselves to me when you stole what wasn't yours. Now every mansion by that lake is at my mercy." He sputtered, tried to throw legal jargon at me, but I cut him off with a single line. "Tell your lawyers to check Section 4, Clause 12 of the 1958 Cedar Water Agreement. It'll shut them up faster than I can." His face drained of color. He didn't admit it, but he knew. He stormed off, muttering curses, but the fear in his stride told me everything. That night, I got my first call from a high-end broker. The kind of call that starts with, "Are you serious about selling access rights?" followed by numbers that made my chest tighten with adrenaline. Because if they thought I was bluffing, they were about to learn just how far I was willing to go. And as I sat there in the quiet of my kitchen, staring at the phone after hanging up, I realized something. Revenge wasn't just about reclaiming what they stole. It was about watching their empire crumble while I rose from the ashes. For years, they treated me like the outsider, the dumb rancher, the man who didn't belong. But now, I was holding the keys to their paradise. And soon, I'd make sure they paid for every tear Emily cried, every question Daniel asked. Every night I sat awake, feeling like a failure. This was just the beginning. The first sale wasn't even about money. It was about sending a message. When the broker called me back a week later with a potential buyer, I could hardly believe it. A private investor, someone who didn't care about living in those mansions but cared very much about water access rights, was ready to move fast. I sat at my kitchen table, papers spread out before me, my pulse pounding as I signed the initial agreements. Emily sat across from me, biting her lip, her hands trembling as she held the papers steady while I signed. "You're really doing this," she whispered, her voice filled with equal parts fear and awe. "I have to," I said, my jaw tight. "They took everything from us. If I let them walk away with it, then what does that make me? What does that teach, Daniel?" The deal was clean, legal, and devastating. For a six-figure sum more money than I'd seen in years, I sold partial rights to Cedar Lake's water usage, which meant the HOA no longer had exclusive control. Their homeowners, the ones who paid millions for lakefront luxury, suddenly found themselves sharing water access with a corporation that had no interest in keeping things quiet. The fallout was immediate. Within days, I started hearing about furious meetings. The HOA board scrambled, Walters pacing in circles while homeowners shouted at him. Rumors trickled down to me through neighbors. Talk of lawsuits. Talk of how could this happen, and worst of all for them, talk of property values dropping. Because no one pays $10 million for a mansion if the lake outside their window can be leased, used, or even drained at the discretion of an outsider. I didn't even have to show my face. My silence drove them insane. One evening, while Emily cooked dinner and Daniel sat at the table doing homework, there was a knock on the door. It was a woman I recognized, Karen Holt, one of the wealthiest HOA members. Her house was a sprawling glass and stone monstrosity right on the water, with a private dock big enough for 3 boats. She looked desperate, her perfect hair undone, her makeup smudged. "Please," she said, her voice breaking as soon as I opened the door. "You can't do this. My husband, he's already talking about moving. We put everything into that house." I stood in the doorway, arms crossed. For a moment, I thought about slamming the door in her face. But then I saw Emily in the kitchen, quietly watching us, and I knew she was listening. I let Karen keep talking. "Gregory never told us what he was doing. None of us knew they had tied your land into the HOA. We just wanted peace. The lake, the lifestyle. If you do this, you're not just hurting the board, you're hurting families." Her words cut. I won't lie. For a second, I thought of Daniel's face when I told him we couldn't fish at the pond anymore. I thought of Emily's tears on my shoulder the night I told her we might lose everything. And then the bitterness hardened again. "You didn't care when they stole from me," I said quietly. "You didn't knock on my door then. You didn't cry for my family when they locked me out of my barns. You didn't stop them when they tried to erase my legacy. Now you want mercy because you're scared." She opened her mouth, but nothing came out, just a soft whimper. I closed the door. That night, Emily and I argued. She said she understood, but she worried about how far I was willing to go. "You're right, they deserve it," she said, her voice sharp but shaking. "But what about us? What about Daniel? This is going to consume you. You're starting to sound like them." Her words stung more than I expected. I turned away, staring out the window at the moonlit fields that should have been mine, the soil my father's boots had walked. "I'm not them," I muttered. "I'm just giving them back what they gave me." But late at night, lying awake, in the dark, I wondered if Emily was right. Revenge tasted sweet in the moment, but it was also changing me. I could feel the weight of it pressing into my bones. The HOA's panic grew louder with each passing week. They tried to intimidate me with more letters, more threats, but it was too late. The investors were already circling. By the end of the month, I had offers lined up for full control of water rights, offers in the millions. The kind of money that didn't just rebuild my life, but secured Daniel's future at the next HOA meeting. Word leaked that their lakefront properties had officially dropped in value by nearly 30%. That kind of loss isn't just numbers on paper, it's marriages straining under the weight of lost investments. It's neighbors turning on neighbors. It's board members being screamed at by the very people they once lorded over. I wasn't there, but I imagined Walter's face, pale and sweating as the community that once worshipped him now tore him apart. And it wasn't even the end. Not yet, because the moment that broke them was still coming, the moment they realized I wasn't just selling rights. I was selling their paradise piece by piece, till their $10 million mansions were nothing more than overpriced boxes beside a lake they no longer controlled. And when that moment came, it would finally understand what it felt like to lose everything by the time fall rolled around. The HOA was eating itself alive. Word spread through town about the lawsuits. Homeowners suing the HOA board for negligence. Board members pointing fingers at each other, whispering accusations in dark corners of coffee shops. The once flawless neighborhood with its manicured Lawns and glittering mansions had become a battlefield of resentment and fear. And I sat back, watching it unravel like a storm cloud tearing apart in the sky. The first crack came when Walters, the board president, tried to reassure everyone at a meeting that everything was under control. But his confidence was hollow. A recording leaked. Someone in that room had filmed the whole ugly scene. Homeowners screaming at him, demanding their money back. Wives crying. One man slamming his fist on the table so hard the microphone screeched. And Walters, red-faced, trying to shout them down. The video spread online, and the whole county laughed at the mighty HOA tearing itself apart. Emily showed me the video on her phone, her brows furrowed. "This is brutal," she murmured. "You're winning, but do you see what it's doing?" To them, I didn't answer, because I did see a T, and I didn't feel sorry. Not yet. Meanwhile, I was still working deals, quietly, methodically. The investor who bought partial rights came back hungry for more. 2 corporations were bidding against each other for full control of the water supply. The numbers kept climbing, and every call ended with me staring at the walls in silence, hardly believing how much power I held in my hands. But the HOA wasn't going down without a fight. One night, I got a knock at the door well past midnight. I opened it to find Walters himself, flanked by 2 board members, their suits wrinkled, eyes bloodshot. They looked less like leaders and more like desperate men drowning in their own mistakes. "You've made your point," Walters said, his voice hoarse. "We're prepared to offer you a settlement. Substantial. Just stop selling. Stop this madness before you ruin everything." I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, letting the silence hang heavy between us. "Ruin everything," I finally said. "You mean like you ruined me? Like you ruined my family's legacy when you forged papers and sold off land that wasn't yours?" Walters opened his mouth, but I cut him off. "No, I told you. You sold my land, so I'm selling your lake. It's only fair." His composure cracked. He stepped forward, anger finally breaking through the mask of civility. "You think you're clever, but you're destroying families. Kids, you're not just hurting us, you're hurting innocent people who had nothing to do with this." The words stung for a moment because I thought of Daniel, of how he looked at me when I told him the pond wasn't ours anymore. But then I remembered Karen Holt crying on my porch, asking for mercy only when it was her comfort on the line. Where were any of them when I was being robbed blind? Where were their tears when I was locked out of barns my father built with his hands? I stepped closer until I could see the sweat dripping down Walter's temple. Innocent people. The only innocent ones here are my family. You should have thought about kids before you stole their inheritance. The board members shifted nervously behind him, and I knew then that the HOA's unity was gone. Fear was gnawing at them. They couldn't even stand together anymore. When they left, Emily stood in the hallway, arms folded tight. Her face was pale. "How far are you going to take this?" she asked softly. "As far as it takes," I said, and walked past her. Though guilt pricked my chest at the sight of her tears, within a month the lawsuits multiplied. Homeowners dragged each other into court, mansions sat unsold, prices plummeting, like stones in water. For sale signs sprouted across their perfect streets like weeds. Banks stopped approving loans in the subdivision altogether. The dream they built, the dream they stole my land to expand, was crumbling under its own corruption. And then came the blow they never expected. The largest corporate investor signed the papers. Overnight, I transferred controlling water rights of Cedar Lake to them for a staggering sum. Enough to secure Daniel's college, pay off every debt, rebuild what we lost, and still have money left over. The deal made the local paper. The headlines splashed across the front page. HOA's lake rights sold to private firm. The reaction was chaos. Homeowners screamed betrayal. Walters was chased out of meetings, practically carried out under a wave of curses. Some families fled, selling at massive losses just to escape. Others stayed, trapped in million-dollar cages beside a lake they no longer controlled. I drove past the neighborhood one morning just to see it with my own eyes. Perfect driveways littered with moving trucks, lawns unkempt, shouting matches spilling onto sidewalks. A once pristine community rotting from the inside. Emily sat in the passenger seat, quiet. Finally, she whispered, "You did it. You destroyed them." I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, staring at the crumbling paradise. I should have felt triumph, victory, but all I felt was a heavy ache in my chest. Because in destroying them, I'd destroyed a piece of myself too. But it wasn't over. Not yet, because Walters still hadn't paid the price. And until he did, the revenge wouldn't feel complete. Walters didn't vanish quietly. Men like him never do. They cling to power with bloody fingernails even when the world around them is burning. I should have known he wouldn't just disappear into the shadows. And sure enough, just when I thought the board was dead, he made his desperate move. It started with rumors. Someone told me Walters had been going door to door in the subdivision, trying to rally the few homeowners who hadn't already abandoned ship. He promised them he could fix everything. He told them I was bluffing, that my deals weren't binding, that he'd found a way to reverse it all. People wanted to believe him they were drowning, and he was offering a rope. But that rope was frayed, and I knew it. Then came the letter. It was thicker than the rest, written on crisp HOA letterhead, delivered by courier as if it carried some grand authority. Inside, Walters threatened me with a countersuit. He accused me of fraud, extortion, even racketeering. He demanded I reverse the water rights sale or face criminal charges. For a moment, reading it at the kitchen table, my chest tightened. The weight of months of fighting, of carrying my family's hopes on my shoulders, crashed down on me. What if he found a way to make it stick? What if I lost everything all over again? Emily saw the fear in my face and put her hand on mine. "He's bluffing," she said, her voice steady, even though I could see her own fear flickering in her eyes. "He's drowning. And drowning men thrash hardest before they sink." She was right. I took the letter to my attorney, the one I'd quietly retained months ago. He skimmed it with a smirk. "This is laughable," he said, tossing it onto his desk like it was a grocery flyer. "Empty threats. The law is on your side, not his. He's trying to scare you." Still, the thought of Walters walking free, still smirking, still pretending he had power, it ate at me. I wanted more than just his community collapsing. I wanted him broken. Personally, that chance came 2 weeks later when the county scheduled a public hearing about water access complaints. Walters showed up in a pressed suit, his smile glued on like a mask, reporters swarming around him. He stood at the podium, speaking with his old, arrogant charm, painting himself as the victim of a greedy rancher who exploited a loophole. He spoke about families suffering, children displaced, values destroyed. His voice cracked in just the right places. If you didn't know the truth, you might have believed him. I sat in the back, quiet, my documents stacked neatly in a folder. My turn came. My boots echoed against the floor as I walked to the podium. Walters smirked, that smug little grin I'd come to hate more than anything. "Mr. Chairman," I began, holding up the folder. "This isn't about loopholes. This isn't about greed. This is about theft, fraud, and the arrogance of a board that thought it could erase a family's legacy with forged signatures and a rubber stamp." I laid out every piece of evidence. The fake filings, the fraudulent sale, the water rights clause. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Truth was heavy enough to fill the room. Every eye turned from me to Walter's, and I watched the smirk slowly slip from his face as the county clerk confirmed my records were legitimate. And then came the dagger. I pulled out a final document and email chain I'd gotten through Discovery. Walter's own words instructing his board members to fast-track the land sale. Even admitting privately that I had never owed dues and was not legally bound to the HOA. Gasps rippled through the room. The reporters' pens scratched furiously. Across paper. Walter's face drained of color. The chairman leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Mr. Walters, do you have an explanation for this?" Walter stammered, sweat rolling down his temples, words tumbling out in incoherent excuses. For the first time, the mask cracked wide open, and everyone saw the coward underneath. When I stepped down from the podium, I didn't even look at him. I didn't need to. His empire was collapsing in real time, the cameras catching every second. That night, the news ran the headline, "HOA President Exposed in Fraud Scandal." His name was plastered across the county like a brand of shame. Homeowners who once adored him now called for his resignation. Some filed lawsuits personally naming him. The board fractured completely, and Walters stood alone in the wreckage. I thought that would satisfy me. It's truth. When I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling while Emily slept beside me, I realized revenge had become a hunger I couldn't quite sat. I had destroyed his reputation, his neighborhood, his standing. But inside, there was still a hollow ache. Because nothing could bring back the nights I sat powerless. Nothing could erase the look on Daniel's face when I told him we'd lost. The war was ending, but I wasn't sure who I was anymore. And yet, one final chapter still waited. Because Walters, broken and desperate, wasn't finished lashing out. And his last act of spite would test me on my family in a way no courtroom ever could. I should have known Walters wouldn't go quietly. Men like him don't just lose, they drag everyone they can into the fire with them. By the time his name was splashed across every local paper as a fraud, he was already unraveling. But I didn't expect his desperation to come clawing into my own front yard. It was a cold evening, the kind where the sky turns a dull gray before dinner. Emily was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of stew, the smell of onions and broth filling the house. Daniel sat at the table with his homework, pencil tapping as he wrestled with fractions. For a moment, everything felt normal, safe, like we'd clawed our way back to something resembling peace. Then came the pounding on the door. Not a knock. It's a furious, rattling pound that shook the wood in its frame. Daniel froze, wide-eyed. Emily looked at me, the spoon slipping from her hand and clattering against the stove. My chest tightened. I already knew who it was before I opened the door. Walters stood there. His suit was gone, replaced with a wrinkled shirt and a wild look in his eyes. His hair was unkempt, his tie askew, his face red with drink and rage. He reeked of whiskey, his hands trembling as he pointed a finger at me. "You ruined me." He slurred, spit flying as he shouted. "Do you hear me? You ruined everything. My home, my name, my life." I stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind me so Daniel wouldn't hear his madness. "You did that to yourself, Walters," I said coldly. His laugh was jagged, broken. "Don't you dare act like you're better than me. You think you won? You think anyone's on your side? You're a parasite. A bitter old rancher who couldn't keep up with progress, so you destroyed what others built." For a moment, his words dug under my skin. Parasite. Bitter. The exact things I'd feared becoming. But then I saw the madness in his eyes, the shaking in his hands, and I realized this wasn't strength. This was the last howl of a man already gone. He stepped closer, voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "If I can't have this life, neither will you. You'll see. I'll make sure of it." My fists clenched. For one terrifying second, I thought he might pull something from his jacket. A weapon. A gun. My body tensed, ready to fight, to protect Emily and Daniel at any cost. But he didn't. Instead, he staggered off the porch, back to his car parked crooked in my driveway. Tires screeched as he peeled off into the night, leaving behind the echo of his threat. Inside, Emily was pale, holding Daniel tight against her chest. "What did he want?" she whispered. I kissed Daniel's forehead, forcing my voice steady. "Nothing we can't handle." But the truth was, my hands shook long after I tucked him into bed. Walters was unhinged. Cornered animals are dangerous, and I knew he wasn't finished. Days later, I got the call. One of the new corporate owners of the water rights rang me. Furious. Someone had sabotaged their intake pumps by the lake. Valves smashed, equipment destroyed. Tens of thousands in damages. And though no one said his name, I didn't need to be told who had done it. The sheriff showed up at my place that evening. He was an old friend of my father's, hat in hand. Face grim. "We picked Walters up near the lake," he said. "Drunk, trespassing, muttering about you. He'll be charged, but he's spiraling fast." Man's lost everything. I nodded, jaw tight. A part of me wanted to laugh, to let the satisfaction roll over me. But another part, the part that remembered standing powerless in my own kitchen months ago, felt something different. A heaviness. Because for all his cruelty, Walters was still human. Broken, pathetic, and maybe that was punishment enough. That night. Emily sat beside me on the porch. The stars stretched wide above us. "It's over," she whispered, leaning against my shoulder. "Maybe," I said, "but it doesn't feel like it." She turned to me, her voice soft but firm. "Because you don't know how to let go. You got justice, but you're still holding on to the hate. And if you don't let go, John, you'll end up just like him." Her words cut deep, deeper than Walters ever could. I stared at the dark. Fields, the ones that should have been mine, and for the first time. I wondered if revenge had cost me more than it gave. But I also knew one thing. Walters wasn't done trying to drag me down with him. And before this story ended, I'd have to face the final test, choosing between crushing him completely or finding the strength to walk away. The night I signed the final papers, I felt both exhausted and alive, as if a storm that had raged for years inside my chest was finally breaking apart into sunlight. For so long, the HOA had mocked me, trampled my rights, and stolen the very ground my family had bled to preserve. But now the tables had turned, and the very people who thought they were untouchable stood in shock, staring at the wreckage of their pride. Their mansions, those gleaming symbols of wealth and arrogance, were no longer theirs. The $10 million lakefront dream they had built was now legally sold off. Piece by piece, to outsiders who didn't bow to their board or bend to their rules. They were homeless, humiliated, and stripped bare, just as they had tried to do to me. But before that victory came, the final battle between us had pushed me to my very core. The night before the sale closed, I received a visit I wasn't expecting. Margaret, the HOA president, the same woman who once stood on my porch and smugly told me my family's heritage meant nothing compared to progress, showed up at my cabin in the middle of a storm. Rain poured down her face, and her once perfect hair clung to her cheeks. She looked broken, a shadow of the powerful tyrant who had ruled over her board like a queen. "Please," she whispered as she stepped onto my porch. "You can't do this. You can't take our homes. There are families, children, people who've done nothing to you. Think of them." I stared at her, remembering the countless nights I had sat at that same table with my wife crying beside me because of the stress their lawsuits and fines had caused. I remembered watching my daughter pack up her childhood things, believing we would lose everything. My voice cracked as I replied, "You didn't think of my family. You didn't think of my children when you forged documents to sell my land. You didn't think of the pain when you tried to erase generations of history just to make a profit. Why should I think of yours now?" Her lips trembled, and for the first time, she had no words. The woman who had ruined lives with a signature couldn't defend herself when the mirror was turned back on her the next morning. When the HOA board gathered for what they thought was another meeting to try and block me, they were met with legal papers, lawyers, and buyers. The ink was fresh, the signatures sealed. It was done. Their lakefront paradise was no longer theirs. Kay shouted, they begged, some even threatened, but none of it mattered. The judge's order was final. The irony was thick. The very land they stole from me gave me the leverage to take from them everything they valued most. Neighbors, who once turned their backs on me, watched from their manicured lawns as moving trucks arrived, as for sale. Signs were planted on what they thought were untouchable estates. Families scrambled. Prideful men who once wore tailored suits now loaded cardboard boxes with shame. The air was heavy with disbelief. I stood on the edge of my ranch, arms folded, as buyers drove through the gates they once called private. Each car that rolled past me was another nail in the coffin of the HOA's empire. But revenge, no matter how sweet, does not erase pain, it only balances the scale. As I watched their world fall apart, I didn't feel pure joy. Instead, I felt something heavier, something closer to peace. My land was safe. My family's name was secure. The ghosts of my ancestors, who had walked that soil and built those fences with their hands, could finally rest. But the cost of the fight, the years of battles, the nights I doubted myself, it all still lingered like scars I would carry forever. Margaret approached me one last time before leaving the neighborhood. She once ruled. Her mansion, once a fortress of pride, stood hollow behind her, stripped of furniture and light. Was it worth it? She asked, her voice a mix of bitterness and sorrow. I looked at her, at the woman who had believed no one could ever defeat her, and said, yes, because now you'll understand what it feels like to lose something that was never yours to take. She turned without another word, her heels sinking into the mud of the land she had claimed to own. Walking away into a future she never planned for, life on my ranch slowly returned to what it should have been all along: quiet mornings, family dinners, the sound of my daughter laughing again without the shadow of fear hanging over us. My wife held me one evening on the porch and whispered, "It's over. We're home." Those words sank deeper than any victory ever could. Because for me, it was never about the money, never about the mansions, and not even about revenge. It was about home. And now, home was safe. Years later, when I walk the boundaries of my 1,500 acres, I can still see the faint outlines of where the HOA's arrogance tried to carve through my life. But instead of bitterness, I feel pride. Pride that I stood my ground. Pride that I didn't break when they tried to crush me. And pride that I honored the people who came before me. The lake still glitters under the sun, but it belongs to strangers. Now people who don't bow to HOA rules, people who respect the land for what it is. Every time I see their kids laughing by the water, I know justice wasn't just served. It was written into the soil. And so, the story of how the HOA illegally sold my 1,500 acres, only for me to legally sell off their $10 million mansions, became more than just a tale of revenge. It became a lesson. Never underestimate the quiet man guarding his home. Because behind his silence may lie the strength to bring down an empire.